The screaming stopped at dawn. For 3 days, the people of Würzburg had listened to Margaret Hermann's agony echoing from the torture chamber beneath the bishop's palace. When silence finally came, they thought her suffering was over. They were wrong. What came next would make her previous torment look like mercy. Her executioners weren't finished with her yet, they were just getting started. You think you understand medieval justice? You've seen the movies, read the histories, felt the appropriate horror at humanity's dark past. But what happened to Margaret Hermann in 1626 goes beyond anything Hollywood has dared to show. This wasn't just execution. This wasn't even just torture. This was the systematic destruction of a human being, piece by piece, designed to break not just her body, but her very soul. And the most disturbing part? It was all perfectly legal. Today we're diving into one of history's most horrific witch trials, a case that reveals the true depths of judicial sadism disguised as a religious duty. You're about to discover how fear, superstition, and political ambition combine to create a machine of human suffering so efficient it would make modern totalitarian regimes look amateur. This isn't just history. This is a warning written in blood and screams about what happens when justice becomes vengeance and law becomes license for limitless cruelty. Before we begin this journey into humanity's darkest chapter, I want you to understand something. Every detail I'm about to share is documented in court records, witness testimonies, and official church archives. This isn't folklore or legend. This is what actually happened when civilization decided that destroying witches was more important than preserving humanity. The records survive because the perpetrators were proud of their work. They wanted the world to know what they had done. Margaret Hermann wasn't a witch. She was a 43-year-old widow living in Würzburg, struggling to survive in a world where being female and vulnerable made you a target. She sold herbs at the local market, tended to sick neighbors, and lived quietly in a small house her deceased husband had left her. In any reasonable world, she would have lived out her days in obscurity and died peacefully in her bed. But Würzburg in 1696 wasn't a reasonable world. It was a place where reason had been replaced by religious mania, and justice had been corrupted into something monstrous. The witch-hunting fever that consumed the Holy Roman Empire didn't happen overnight. It was the result of decades of fear, superstition, and deliberate manipulation by those who profited from terror. Prince Bishop Julius Ector had transformed Würzburg into the epicenter of the most systematic witch persecution in European history. Between 1626 and 1631, over 900 people would be executed for witchcraft in this single German city. 900 souls destroyed by a machine of judicial murder that operated with bureaucratic efficiency. But Margaret's case was different. Even in an era of unimaginable cruelty, what they did to her stood out. The records describe tortures so elaborate, so carefully designed to maximize suffering, that reading them feels like descending into hell itself. The men who destroyed her weren't driven by religious fervor or genuine belief in witchcraft. They were artists of agony, craftsmen of cruelty who had perfected the science of human destruction. Here's what most people don't understand about the witch trials. They weren't random acts of mob violence or spontaneous outbursts of religious hysteria. They were carefully orchestrated campaigns of terror designed to serve specific political and economic purposes. The property of convicted witches was confiscated by the church and state. The fear they generated kept populations docile and dependent on religious authority. The spectacle of public torture and execution reminded everyone what happened to those who stepped out of line. Margaret became a target not because she practiced magic, but because she was vulnerable and convenient. Her husband's death had left her without male protection. Her herbal knowledge made her useful to the community, but also suspicious to those looking for scapegoats. Most importantly, she owned property that others coveted. In the twisted logic of witch persecution, her very existence was evidence of guilt. The process began with whispers. A neighbor's cow died unexpectedly after Margaret had walked past the field. A child fell ill after accepting herbs from her. A merchant's wife experienced nightmares after arguing with her at the market. None of these events were connected to Margaret in any logical way, but logic had no place in witch hunting. Correlation became causation. Coincidence became conspiracy. Suspicion became certainty. The accusations grew bolder. Someone claimed to have seen her talking to a black cat at midnight. Another swore they witnessed her making strange gestures while mixing herbs. A third insisted she had cursed their family after a business dispute. Each accusation built upon the last, creating a mythology of malevolence around a woman whose greatest crime was surviving without a husband's protection. What makes Margaret's story particularly heartbreaking is how desperately she tried to maintain her innocence. When the first accusations surfaced, she voluntarily appeared before the local magistrate to defend herself. She brought witnesses who testified to her good character. She offered to undergo any tests they deemed necessary to prove her innocence. She even agreed to leave Würzburg permanently if that would end the suspicions against her. Her willingness to cooperate was seen as further evidence of guilt. The witch hunters had developed an elaborate theology of deception that made innocence impossible to prove. If you confessed immediately, it proved you were a witch. If you maintained your innocence, it proved you were a particularly dangerous witch who had been trained by the devil to resist interrogation. If you offered to leave town, it proved you were planning to spread your evil elsewhere. Every response was twisted into confirmation of guilt. The legal framework that enabled Margaret's destruction had been refined over decades of witch persecution. The Malleus Maleficarum, written in 1487, provided a comprehensive guide to identifying, prosecuting, and executing witches. Local authorities had adapted its recommendations into a systematic process that guaranteed conviction once accusations were made. The presumption of innocence didn't exist. The burden of proof lay entirely on the accused, and the methods used to extract proof made resistance impossible. Prince Bishop Julius Ector's administration had perfected this system into something approaching industrial efficiency. They had professional witch-finders who traveled from town to town identifying suspects. They had specialized torture chambers equipped with the latest instruments of agony. They had trained interrogators who could break the strongest will through carefully applied pain. They had executioners who could prolong death for hours or even days to maximize the spectacle and the terror. The economic incentives that drove this machine were substantial. Each witch trial generated revenue from confiscated property, court fees, and execution costs. The families of the accused were charged for the very torture instruments used to extract confessions from their loved ones. They paid for the wood that burned the bodies. They paid for the meals fed to the executioners. The witch trials were literally profitable enterprises that funded the expansion of church and state power. When Margaret was finally arrested in March 1626, she still believed that truth would save her. She had lived an honest life, harmed no one, and served her community faithfully. Surely the authorities would recognize their mistake once they investigated the accusations properly. She couldn't imagine that the investigation itself was designed not to discover truth, but to manufacture guilt. She didn't understand that her arrest was not the beginning of a legal process, but the final step in a predetermined execution. The charges against her read like a catalog of medieval superstitions. She was accused of making a pact with the devil, attending witches' sabbaths, causing crop failures through magic, poisoning livestock with curses, and corrupting the minds of children with heretical teachings. Each charge carried the death penalty. Each charge was impossible to disprove using the legal standards of the time. Each charge was designed to ensure that escape was impossible once the machinery of persecution began turning. The witnesses against her included people she had considered friends. Neighbors who had accepted her help in times of illness now testified that her remedies were demonic in origin. Former customers who had purchased her herbs claimed they were ingredients for evil spells. Even her own relatives, terrified of being associated with an accused witch, provided testimony that supported the charges against her. What's most chilling about these witness statements is their formulaic nature. They all follow the same pattern, use the same language, and describe the same supernatural phenomena. This wasn't coincidence. The witnesses had been coached by professional witch-finders who knew exactly what testimony would satisfy the court. Many were probably threatened with their own prosecution if they refused to cooperate. Others were offered rewards for providing useful information. The preliminary hearing was a masterpiece of judicial theater designed to demonstrate the inevitability of conviction. Margaret was brought before a panel of judges wearing their finest robes and speaking in solemn Latin phrases that emphasized the gravity of her supposed crimes. The charges were read aloud in dramatic fashion while she stood in chains, already marked as guilty by her very appearance in court. Her appointed defense counsel was a young lawyer with no experience in witchcraft cases and no real interest in challenging the prosecution. His role was purely ceremonial, designed to provide the appearance of due process while ensuring that no effective defense was mounted. He advised Margaret to confess immediately and throw herself on the mercy of the court, advice that would have guaranteed her death while providing legal cover for her executioners. Margarete refused to confess because she had nothing to confess to. This sealed her fate. In the twisted logic of witch persecution, maintaining innocence in the face of overwhelming evidence was itself proof of supernatural corruption. Only the devil could give someone the strength to resist confession when confronted with the truth of their crimes. Her refusal to admit guilt became the final piece of evidence needed to justify the horrors that would follow. The sentence was pronounced with ceremonial gravity that masked its essential barbarity. Margaret would be subjected to intensive interrogation until she confessed her crimes and revealed the names of her accomplices. If she proved resistant to standard questioning, enhanced techniques would be employed to overcome her supernatural protection. Once a full confession was obtained, she would be executed in a manner befitting the severity of her crimes. What this legal language concealed was a program of systematic torture designed to break her mind, body, and spirit in the most agonizing way possible. The interrogation would continue until she said whatever her torturers wanted to hear. The enhanced techniques were instruments of agony that would leave her begging for death. The execution would be a public spectacle of cruelty designed to terrorize anyone who might be tempted to follow her path. As Margaret was led back to her cell to await the beginning of her ordeal, she still hoped for intervention from some higher authority. Surely the Prince Bishop himself would recognize the injustice being done in his name. Surely the church hierarchy would intervene to prevent the torture of an innocent woman. Surely God himself would not allow such evil to triumph over truth. She had no way of knowing that the Prince Bishop was the architect of the entire system. That the church hierarchy not only approved but actively encouraged the witch persecutions. That the God she prayed to for salvation was being invoked by her torturers to justify every horror they would inflict upon her. She was trapped in a nightmare where all the institutions she trusted had been corrupted into instruments of her destruction. The machine that would consume Margaret Herman had been years in the making. Every legal precedent, every torture device, every procedural innovation had been tested and refined on previous victims. She was about to become the latest subject in an ongoing experiment in human destruction. A laboratory specimen in the study of how much agony a human soul could endure before it finally broke. What happened next would test the very limits of human endurance and reveal depths of cruelty that challenge our understanding of civilization itself. The cell door opened at midnight. 3 men entered without speaking, their faces hidden behind leather masks that made them look more like demons than human beings. They moved with the practiced efficiency of craftsmen beginning a familiar task. Margaret pressed herself against the stone wall, finally understanding that her prayers would not be answered, that mercy would not come, that the nightmare she had stumbled into had no end except the one they would choose for her. The torture chamber beneath the bishop's palace was a monument to human ingenuity perverted into evil. Every surface was stained with the suffering of previous victims. Iron rings embedded in the walls held chains worn smooth by countless hands that had pulled against them in agony. The air itself seemed thick with accumulated screams, as if the very stones had absorbed the pain inflicted within these walls, and now exhaled it back into the darkness. The instruments arranged on wooden tables looked like the tools of some infernal craftsman. Each device had been designed with scientific precision to maximize suffering while preventing death. The thumb screws could crush bones slowly, joint by joint. The leg irons could be tightened gradually until circulation stopped and tissue began to die. The iron boots could compress a human foot until it resembled a mangled piece of meat. But these were just the beginning. The true masterpieces of torture were the larger devices that dominated the center of the chamber. The rack could stretch a human body until joints dislocated and ligaments snapped. The strappado could suspend a victim by their arms, twisted behind their back until shoulders separated and muscles tore. The ladder could bend a spine backward until a vertebrae cracked like kindling. The interrogators who operated these instruments were not sadistic monsters driven by personal cruelty. They were professionals who approached their work with the same methodical dedication that other craftsmen brought to their trades. They had studied human anatomy to understand exactly how much damage they could inflict without causing immediate death. They had practiced their techniques on dozens of previous victims to perfect their methods. What made them truly terrifying was their absolute conviction in the righteousness of their work. They genuinely believed they were saving Margaret's soul by destroying her body. Every scream they extracted was a victory over Satan. Every confession they forced was a triumph of divine justice. They tortured her with the same sense of holy purpose that other men brought to prayer. The session began with what they called gentle persuasion. Margaret was stripped naked and chained to the wall, while her interrogators explained exactly what would happen to her if she continued to resist confession. They described each instrument in clinical detail, explaining how it worked and what sensations she could expect to experience. This psychological torture was often more effective than physical pain, breaking victims before the actual torture even began. Margaret listened to their descriptions with growing horror, but she still refused to confess to crimes she had never committed. Her stubborn adherence to truth in the face of overwhelming pressure was seen as further evidence of demonic protection. If she were merely human, the threat of torture would have been enough to break her. Only supernatural power could give someone the strength to resist such persuasion. The interrogators began with the thumb screws, devices that looked deceptively simple but were capable of inflicting extraordinary agony. They placed Margaret's thumbs between metal plates and began turning the screws slowly, applying pressure that gradually increased from uncomfortable to unbearable. The pain started as a dull ache, but quickly escalated to burning agony as the metal crushed through skin and muscle toward bone. She held out for nearly an hour before the pain became too much to bear. But when she finally screamed, it wasn't the confession her torturers wanted to hear. It was a cry of pure agony that contained no words, no admissions, no surrender of her essential truth. This enraged her interrogators, who interpreted her screams as mockery of their authority. They moved to the leg irons, metal bands that could be tightened around the lower legs until they cut through flesh and crushed bone. The interrogators adjusted the screws with deliberate slowness, watching Margaret's face for signs that she was ready to confess. They had learned to read the subtle changes in expression that preceded surrender, the moment when pain overwhelmed will and truth became irrelevant. The agony was indescribable. The metal bands cut through her skin like knives while simultaneously crushing the bones beneath. Blood ran down her legs in steady streams, pooling on the stone floor beneath her feet. The pain was so intense that her vision blurred and her consciousness began to fade, but her torturers had techniques to keep her awake and aware of every sensation. They used smelling salts to revive her when she fainted. They applied heated irons to sensitive areas to shock her back to full consciousness. They had studied the human body's responses to trauma and knew exactly how to keep their victims on the edge of unconsciousness without allowing them to escape into merciful oblivion. Between applications of torture, they offered her opportunities to confess. All she had to do was admit that she had made a pact with the devil, and the pain would stop immediately. She would be given food, water, and medical treatment. She could even have visitors from her family. All she had to do was say the words they wanted to hear. But Margareta couldn't bring herself to lie, even to end her suffering. Some core of integrity remained intact, despite the agony consuming her body. She continued to maintain her innocence even as her torturers escalated their methods, moving from simple instruments to the more elaborate devices that had been perfected over decades of use. The strappado was considered one of the most effective torture methods because it caused excruciating pain while leaving few visible marks on the victim's body. Margaret's hands were tied behind her back and attached to a rope that ran through a pulley in the ceiling. She was then hoisted into the air until her full body weight hung from her twisted arms. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Her shoulders dislocated with audible pops as they took the full weight of her body. The rope cut into her wrists and blood began to flow down her arms. But the true agony came from the position itself, which put every joint and muscle in her upper body under stress that quickly became unbearable. The interrogators could control the intensity of the torture by raising or lowering her body, adding weights to increase the stress on her joints, or dropping her suddenly to jerk her arms nearly out of their sockets. They had developed a repertoire of variations that could keep a victim in agony for hours without causing death. They questioned her while she hung there, their voices calm and reasonable despite the horror they were inflicting. Did she remember attending the witch's sabbath on the hill outside town? Could she describe the devil's appearance when he came to claim her soul? What other women in Würzburg had she corrupted with her evil teachings? Each question was accompanied by an adjustment to her position that sent new waves of agony through her tortured body. When she failed to provide the answers they wanted, they would drop her suddenly, sending shockwaves of pain through her dislocated joints. When she maintained her innocence, they would add iron weights to her feet, increasing the stress on her already damaged shoulders. The psychological warfare was as brutal as the physical torture. Her interrogators told her that other accused witches had already confessed and named her as an accomplice. They claimed to have witnesses who had seen her performing magic rituals. They insisted that her continued denials were an insult to God and an obstruction of divine justice. They brought in a priest who offered to hear her final confession before she died. The clergyman spoke in gentle tones about the mercy of God and the forgiveness available to those who truly repented of their sins. But his presence was just another form of torture, designed to break down her psychological defenses by offering false hope of salvation. Hours passed in this hellish routine of torture, questioning, and false comfort. Margaret's body was systematically destroyed while her interrogators maintained the pretense that they were conducting a legal investigation. They documented every session in careful detail, recording her responses and noting which methods proved most effective in breaking down her resistance. The records they kept reveal the scientific approach they brought to their work. They noted that thumbscrews were most effective in the early stages of interrogation, before the victim's pain tolerance had been elevated by more severe tortures. They observed that the strappado worked best when combined with psychological pressure from clergy members. They recorded optimal time intervals between torture sessions to maximize suffering while preventing death. This wasn't random cruelty or uncontrolled violence. It was systematic torture conducted with the same methodical precision that other professionals brought to their work. The interrogators had transformed human destruction into a science, complete with techniques, procedures, and measurable outcomes. As dawn approached, Margaret's body had been pushed to the limits of human endurance. Her thumbs were crushed beyond recognition. Her legs were mangled and bleeding from the iron bands. Her shoulders were dislocated and her arms hung at unnatural angles from hours on the strappado. But she had not confessed. This presented her torturers with a dilemma. Their methods had proven ineffective against her supernatural resistance. Clearly, the devil was protecting her more strongly than they had anticipated. More extreme measures would be necessary to break through the demonic barriers that prevented her from confessing her obvious guilt. They consulted their manuals and discussed their options with the scholarly detachment of physicians, debating treatment protocols. The Malleus Maleficarum provided guidance for cases of exceptional resistance, recommending escalation to methods that were normally reserved for the most dangerous witches. Margaret's stubborn refusal to confess had earned her a place in this exclusive category. The next phase of her interrogation would involve techniques so extreme that they were rarely used, methods that pushed the boundaries of what the human body could survive. The interrogators spoke of these procedures with the same matter-of-fact tone they had used to describe the thumbscrews, but their eyes betrayed an anticipation that revealed the true nature lurking beneath their professional facade. They were about to demonstrate why Würzburg had become the most feared destination in the Holy Roman Empire for anyone accused of witchcraft. The reputation they had built was not based on the number of witches they executed, but on the elaborate cruelties they had devised to make those executions as agonizing as possible. Margaret was about to discover exactly what that reputation meant. As the sun rose over Würzburg, casting pale light through the narrow windows of the torture chamber, the real horror was just beginning. What they had done to her so far would seem merciful compared to what was coming next. The screaming that had echoed through the night was merely the overture to a symphony of agony that would test the very limits of human suffering. The morning brought no relief, only fresh horrors. The interrogators had consulted their grimoire of agony and selected instruments that would make the previous night's tortures seem like gentle caresses. They spoke in hushed, reverent tones about techniques so extreme they were reserved for only the most stubborn cases. Margaret had earned this distinction through her refusal to abandon truth, and now she would pay the ultimate price for her integrity. They began with fire, the element that would eventually claim her life, but was now employed as a tool of persuasion. Heated irons glowed orange in the brazier, while her torturers explained their purpose with clinical precision. These weren't instruments of execution, but of education, designed to teach her body lessons her mind had refused to learn. The smell of burning metal filled the chamber as they prepared to write their message directly onto her flesh. The first touch of the heated iron against her skin produced a scream that echoed through the palace above. Servants crossing the courtyard paused at the sound, crossing themselves and hurrying past. The citizens of Würzburg had grown accustomed to such sounds emanating from the bishop's palace, but they never failed to send chills through those who heard them. Everyone knew what those screams meant. Another witch was learning the price of resistance. The interrogators worked with methodical precision, applying the heated metal to areas of her body where the pain would be most intense without causing immediate death. They had mapped the human nervous system through years of practice, identifying points where agony could be maximized while keeping their subject conscious and responsive. Each application was calculated to break down her defenses without destroying their ability to continue the interrogation. Between burns, they offered her water and spoke to her in gentle tones about the mercy that awaited those who confessed their crimes. They painted vivid pictures of the peaceful death she could earn through cooperation, describing how quickly the flames would consume a repentant witch compared to the prolonged agony that awaited the unrepentant. Their voices carried the sincere compassion of those who genuinely believed they were offering salvation, but Margaret's spirit remained unbroken despite her body's destruction. Each offer of mercy was met with the same quiet insistence on her innocence. She would not confess to crimes she had never committed, even if maintaining that truth meant enduring horrors beyond imagination. Her torturers interpreted this resistance as further proof of demonic protection, confirming their belief that more extreme measures were justified. They brought out devices that most of their colleagues had never seen used. The Spanish chair was a throne of iron spikes that could be heated until it glowed red hot. Victims were strapped to its surface while the metal gradually warmed, cooking their flesh slowly and evenly. The interrogators could control the temperature precisely, maintaining levels that caused excruciating pain without immediately killing their subject. The Iron Maiden was a coffin-shaped device lined with spikes positioned to pierce the victim's body without hitting vital organs. The spikes were arranged with mathematical precision to maximize pain while preserving life for as long as possible. Victims could survive for hours inside the device, experiencing constant agony as every movement drove the iron points deeper into their flesh. But these elaborate instruments were merely tools. The true horror lay in the minds of the men who wielded them. They had studied suffering the way other scholars studied mathematics or theology, developing theories about pain tolerance, psychological breaking points, and the optimal application of terror. Their knowledge was encyclopedic, and their methods were refined through countless experiments on human subjects. The psychological warfare intensified as Margaret's physical resistance began to weaken. They brought in witnesses who testified to having seen her perform impossible feats of magic. Former friends described supernatural events that had supposedly occurred in her presence. Neighbors recounted dreams in which she had appeared to them as a demonic apparition, threatening their families with curses and plagues. These testimonies were carefully orchestrated performances designed to convince Margaret that her guilt was already established beyond doubt. The witnesses had been coached in their stories, threatened with their own prosecution if they refused to cooperate, and rewarded for providing useful details. Their performances were so convincing that even some of the court officials began to believe the elaborate fiction they had created around her. The interrogators also employed techniques borrowed from the Inquisition's long experience with extracting confessions from heretics. They created false documents purporting to show correspondence between Margaret and known witches in other cities. They produced forged confessions from supposed accomplices who had already been executed, each one naming her as a leader in their diabolic activities. They even brought in a supposed expert in demonology who examined her body for devil's marks, the invisible signs that Satan was said to leave on his followers. Every blemish, scar, or irregularity was interpreted as evidence of supernatural corruption. Moles became devil's nipples. Scars became ritual markings. Even the calluses on her hands from years of honest labor were twisted into proof of her evil practices. The expert's examination was conducted with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized every aspect of the witch-hunting process. He measured each mark, noted its position relative to other features, and consulted ancient texts that supposedly provided guidance for interpreting these diabolic signatures. His conclusions were predetermined, but the elaborate ritual of examination lent them an air of scientific authority. As the days passed, Margaret's body began to fail under the relentless assault. The burns from the heated irons became infected, filling the air with the stench of rotting flesh. Her crushed thumbs turned black with gangrene, and her mangled legs could no longer support her weight. But her torturers had techniques for keeping her alive, even as her body disintegrated around her. They consulted with physicians who specialized in maintaining torture victims just this side of death. These medical experts could assess exactly how much damage a body could sustain while remaining capable of experiencing pain. They prescribed treatments that would prevent fatal infections while ensuring that the victim remained conscious and responsive to further torture. The physicians also provided stimulants that could revive victims who had fainted from pain, keeping them awake to experience every moment of their ordeal. They had developed a pharmacological arsenal designed specifically for use in torture chambers, drugs that could enhance pain sensitivity, prevent unconsciousness, and prolong suffering for days or even weeks. This medical involvement transformed torture from a crude application of pain into a sophisticated science of suffering. The physicians brought the same analytical approach to human destruction that they applied to healing, studying the effects of various tortures and developing methods to optimize their impact. Their detailed notes would later be compiled into manuals that guided future interrogations. The combination of physical torture, psychological manipulation, and medical intervention created a system of human destruction that was virtually impossible to resist. Even the strongest will eventually broke under the methodical application of pain, terror, and despair. The interrogators had perfected their craft through decades of practice, and they approached each new victim with the confidence of masters working in their chosen field. But Margaret continued to resist despite everything they did to her. Her refusal to confess became a source of professional frustration for her torturers, who took pride in their ability to break even the most stubborn subjects. They began to view her case as a personal challenge, a test of their skills against supernatural protection. They escalated to methods that pushed the boundaries of what even they considered acceptable. The water torture involved forcing gallons of liquid down the victim's throat until their stomach distended painfully, then pressing on the swollen abdomen to create the sensation of drowning. The procedure could be repeated dozens of times, each cycle bringing the victim to the edge of death before pulling them back for another round. The Judas cradle was a pyramid-shaped device that victims were slowly lowered onto, the point penetrating their body while their weight drove it deeper. The torture could last for hours as the victim was gradually impaled, every movement increasing their agony. The interrogators could control the pace precisely, maintaining the victim at the edge of consciousness while extracting confessions through carefully applied pressure. These extreme methods were rarely used because they often killed the victim before a useful confession could be obtained. But Margaret's resistance had pushed her case into territory that few torture victims ever reached. Her interrogators were now operating at the limits of their craft, employing techniques that tested their own expertise as much as her endurance. The documentation of these sessions reveals the bureaucratic nature of even the most extreme torture. Every method was recorded, every response noted, every variation cataloged for future reference. The interrogators maintained detailed logs that read like scientific experiments, complete with hypotheses about which techniques would prove most effective, and observations about the subject's responses. They also kept careful financial records, noting the costs of various torture devices, the fees paid to medical consultants, and the expenses associated with maintaining a victim for extended periods. The witch trials were not just instruments of terror, but profitable enterprises that generated substantial revenue for the church and state authorities who conducted them. As Margaret's ordeal entered its second week, her torturers faced a dilemma that challenged their professional expertise. Standard techniques had failed to break her resistance. Enhanced methods had proven equally ineffective. Even their most extreme procedures had not produced the confession they needed to justify her execution. This unprecedented resistance forced them to consult with colleagues from other cities who had experience with particularly difficult cases. Letters were exchanged describing Margaret's symptoms and responses, seeking advice from the most skilled interrogators in the Holy Roman Empire. Her case was becoming a matter of professional interest throughout the witch-hunting community. The responses they received recommended techniques so extreme that they were considered experimental even by torture standards. These methods had been developed by interrogators who had pushed their craft into territories that challenged the very definition of humanity. They involved combinations of physical, psychological, and spiritual torment that aimed to destroy not just the body, but the soul itself. The final phase of Margaret's interrogation would involve procedures that existed at the absolute limits of human cruelty. Her torturers spoke of these methods with the reverent tones usually reserved for sacred rituals, recognizing that they were about to cross boundaries that separated skilled craftsmen from true artists of agony. What they planned for her would test not just her endurance, but their own capacity for inflicting suffering. The preparations alone took days as specialized equipment was constructed and exotic materials were gathered from across the region. The interrogators studied ancient texts and consulted with experts who claimed knowledge of techniques dating back to the earliest days of the Church's war against heresy. They were preparing to employ methods that had been perfected through centuries of human suffering. As these preparations continued, Margaret hung in her chains, her body a roadmap of torture that told the story of her resistance. Every burn, every break, every mutilation marked another moment when she had chosen truth over relief, integrity over survival. Her torturers looked upon their handiwork with professional pride, seeing in her destroyed flesh the evidence of their skill and dedication. But they also saw in her continued defiance a challenge that demanded their ultimate response. The final act of her destruction would require techniques that pushed beyond mere torture into realms of cruelty that challenged the very boundaries of human imagination. What they planned for her would ensure that her death became not just an execution, but a masterpiece of suffering that would be remembered for generations. The citizens of Würzburg waited in anticipation, knowing that something extraordinary was building within the walls of the bishop's palace. The screams that echoed from the torture chambers had taken on a different quality, a note of agony so pure and intense that it seemed to vibrate in the very stones of the city. Everyone understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a demonstration of judicial power that would redefine the boundaries of legal punishment. The morning of the 15th day brought visitors to the torture chamber. Prince Bishop Julius Ector himself descended into the stone depths, accompanied by learned doctors from across the Holy Roman Empire who had traveled to Würzburg specifically to witness what was being called the ultimate test of interrogation science. Word had spread through academic circles that an unprecedented case of demonic resistance was being studied in the bishop's palace, and scholars of demonology had gathered to observe the final phase of what they considered a landmark experiment in the extraction of supernatural confession. The prince bishop moved through the chamber with the measured steps of a man surveying his greatest achievement. The torture devices arranged throughout the space represented decades of refinement and innovation in the science of human suffering. Each instrument had been tested and perfected through the destruction of hundreds of previous victims, their agonies contributing to an accumulated knowledge of pain that now approached artistic perfection. Margarete hung from her chains like a broken doll, her body so damaged that she barely resembled a human being. Her skin hung in charred ribbons where the heated irons had done their work. Her limbs were twisted at impossible angles from repeated sessions on the rack and strappado. Her face was so swollen from beatings that her features were unrecognizable. Yet somehow, impossibly, she still breathed. The assembled scholars examined her with the clinical interest of physicians studying an unusual medical case. They noted the extent of her injuries, marveled at her continued survival, and debated the supernatural forces that must be sustaining her through torments that would have killed any normal person within days. Their learned discussions treated her suffering as an intellectual puzzle rather than a human tragedy. Prince Bishop Ector addressed the gathering with the authority of a man who had transformed witch hunting from crude persecution into sophisticated science. He spoke of the theoretical implications of Margaret's resistance, the theological questions raised by her refusal to confess, and the practical challenges her case presented to the established methods of extracting truth from suspected witches. His words carried the weight of absolute conviction in the righteousness of his cause. He genuinely believed that he was conducting a holy war against the forces of darkness, that every scream extracted in these chambers was a victory for divine justice. The elaborate cruelties he had authorized were not sadistic indulgences, but necessary weapons in humanity's struggle against supernatural evil. The scholars nodded in agreement as he outlined the theoretical framework that justified the horrors they were witnessing. They had constructed an elaborate theology of torture that transformed every act of cruelty into a sacred duty. In their twisted logic, the more a victim suffered, the more certainly their pain proved the existence of the evil that required such extreme measures to combat. But theory would soon give way to practice as the final phase of Margaret's interrogation began. The methods they were about to employ had been developed specifically for cases like hers, situations where standard torture had failed to overcome what they believed was direct demonic protection. These techniques existed at the absolute limits of human endurance, designed to break through supernatural defenses by inflicting suffering so intense that even the devil himself would abandon his followers to escape the agony. The first innovation was the application of torture to multiple victims simultaneously. The interrogators had discovered that psychological torment could be more effective than physical pain when properly applied. They brought Margaret's surviving relatives into the chamber, chaining them where she could see their faces while they prepared to torture them in front of her. Her aged mother was dragged from the cell where she had been held since her own arrest on charges of harboring a witch. The old woman's crime was nothing more than birthing Margaret and failing to recognize the evil that had supposedly grown within her daughter. But in the logic of witch persecution, the mothers of witches were automatically suspect, their guilt established by their failure to prevent their children's corruption. Margaret's 15-year-old niece followed, a girl whose only sin was bearing a family resemblance to the accused witch. The interrogators had developed theories about hereditary witchcraft that made entire bloodlines suspect once a single member was convicted. They spoke of evil that passed through generations like a disease, corrupting each new birth with supernatural malevolence that required extermination. The psychological impact on Margaret was immediate and devastating. For the first time since her ordeal began, tears flowed down her ruined face as she watched her family members being chained to the torture devices. The interrogators had finally found the leverage they needed to break through her supernatural protection. Her love for her family was stronger than whatever demonic forces had sustained her through weeks of personal agony. They began with her mother, applying thumbscrews to the old woman's arthritic hands while Margarete watched in helpless horror. The elderly woman's screams filled the chamber, but they were directed not at her own pain, but at her daughter's suffering. She begged Margaret to confess, to end this nightmare by admitting to whatever crimes they wanted to hear, to save her family from the horrors that awaited them. The interrogators had calculated this moment perfectly. They understood that Margaret's resistance was based on her commitment to truth, her refusal to lie even under the most extreme duress. But truth became irrelevant when maintaining it meant watching her loved ones destroyed before her eyes. The moral calculus that had sustained her through her own torture collapsed when applied to the suffering of innocence. Her niece's torture was even more carefully orchestrated for maximum psychological impact. They began with methods that would cause excruciating pain without permanent damage, techniques that would leave the girl's young body intact while demonstrating exactly what awaited her if Margarete continued to resist. The child's screams were designed to break the last vestiges of the accused witch's supernatural protection. The scholars took detailed notes as they observed the psychological dynamics playing out before them. They recorded Margaret's responses to each escalation of her family's torture, measuring the precise point at which her resistance would finally crack. This data would be invaluable for future cases involving suspects who had proven resistant to personal torture. Prince Bishop Ector watched the proceedings with the satisfaction of a man whose theoretical predictions were being confirmed through practical application. He had pioneered the use of family torture as a means of overcoming supernatural resistance, and Margaret's case was proving the effectiveness of his innovations. The knowledge gained from her destruction would enhance the efficiency of future witch prosecutions throughout the empire. The breaking point came when they brought out the heated irons to use on her niece's face. The girl was barely older than a child, her features still soft with youth and innocence. The thought of that beauty being destroyed by the same methods that had been used on her own flesh finally shattered Margaret's resolve. She could endure any torture inflicted on herself, but she could not watch her family suffer for her principles. Her confession, when it finally came, was everything her interrogators had hoped for and more. Weeks of torture had given her an encyclopedic knowledge of what they wanted to hear, and desperation gave her the creativity to embellish their expectations with details that exceeded their wildest fantasies. She admitted to making pacts with demons, attending Sabbaths where she had consorted with the devil himself, and corrupting dozens of innocent souls with her supernatural evil. But her confessors were not satisfied with admissions of personal guilt. They demanded names of accomplices, descriptions of other witches operating in Würzburg, and detailed accounts of the satanic conspiracy that they believed was threatening Christian civilization. Margaret's imagination, sharpened by weeks of pain and terror, provided them with a rich mythology of evil that implicated half the city in diabolic activities. The scholars recorded every word with scholarly precision, treating her forced testimony as valuable intelligence about the nature of supernatural evil. They asked probing questions designed to extract tactical information about demonic operations, seeking to understand the enemy they believed they were fighting. Her answers, crafted from desperation and delirium, would later be cited as authoritative sources in academic treatises on witchcraft. Her confession lasted for hours as she desperately tried to provide enough detail to satisfy her interrogators and end her family's suffering. She described impossible rituals, named impossible conspirators, and admitted to impossible crimes. Every word was a lie born from love and terror, but her audience received each revelation as confirmation of their deepest fears about the supernatural threat facing their society. The interrogators were particularly interested in her descriptions of the witches' Sabbath, the supposed gatherings where Satan's followers met to plan their attacks on Christian society. Margaret's fevered imagination populated these fictional events with elaborate details about demonic ceremonies, blasphemous rituals, and obscene celebrations that confirmed every stereotype about witchcraft that had been propagated by church authorities. She described flying through the night sky on supernatural winds, consorting with demons who appeared in the forms of animals and monsters, and participating in rituals that inverted every sacred aspect of Christian worship. Her descriptions were so vivid and detailed that even some of the hardened interrogators felt chills of horror at the evil she was supposedly confessing to. The names she provided under torture would doom dozens of other innocent people to the same fate she had endured. Each person she identified as a fellow witch would face arrest, interrogation, and almost certain execution. Her forced testimony became the foundation for an expanded wave of persecution that would consume Würzburg for months to come. But even as she spoke the words that condemned herself and others, Margaret understood the terrible irony of her situation. Her confession was saving her family's lives while destroying her own soul. She was trading her integrity for their survival, accepting damnation to spare them further torture. The moral complexity of this choice was lost on her interrogators, who saw only the triumph of their methods over supernatural resistance. The Prince Bishop himself supervised the recording of her confession, ensuring that every detail was preserved for posterity. This document would become a foundational text in the literature of witchcraft prosecution, cited by future generations of witch hunters as proof of the reality of satanic conspiracy. Margaret's forced lies would contribute to the deaths of thousands of innocent people across Europe. Her family members were released from their chains, but not from custody. They would remain as witnesses to her confession, their survival dependent on their willingness to corroborate her testimony. The interrogators had created a web of mutual destruction that ensured the loyalty of everyone involved. Each person's survival depended on maintaining the fiction that had been extracted through torture. With her confession finally obtained, the legal machinery of execution could begin its final phase. But Margaret's ordeal was far from over. The methods chosen for her death would be as carefully calculated as the tortures that had preceded them, designed to serve as both punishment for her supposed crimes and warning to anyone who might be tempted to follow her path. The execution would be a public spectacle that combined religious ceremony with judicial theater and popular entertainment. Every aspect would be choreographed to maximize the psychological impact on the watching crowd, while demonstrating the power and righteousness of the authorities who had condemned her. Her death would become a lesson in the consequences of challenging the established order. The preparations began immediately, with craftsmen working to construct the elaborate apparatus that would be needed for her execution. This would not be a simple burning at the stake, but a complex performance that would stretch her death across hours while extracting every possible moment of suffering and spectacle from her destruction. The citizens of Würzburg would witness something that would haunt their memories for the rest of their lives. As word spread through the city that the witch's confession had finally been obtained, people began gathering in the squares and marketplaces to discuss what they had heard about her admissions. The details of her supposed crimes grew more elaborate with each retelling, transformed by rumor and imagination into a mythology of evil that exceeded even what she had actually confessed to under torture. The church authorities encouraged this popular excitement, seeing it as confirmation that their methods had successfully protected the community from supernatural threat. They organized special masses of thanksgiving for deliverance from evil, with sermons that praised the wisdom and courage of the Prince Bishop, who had saved them all from diabolic conspiracy. But beneath the public celebration, some citizens felt a creeping unease about what they had witnessed. The screams that had echoed from the bishop's palace had been too human, too familiar. Some began to wonder whether the evil they had been fighting was as supernatural as they had been told, or whether the true evil lay in the methods being used to combat it. These doubts were carefully suppressed by the church authorities, who recognized that questioning the witch trials meant questioning the entire foundation of their power. Anyone who expressed skepticism about the reality of witchcraft or the necessity of torture faced immediate suspicion of harboring sympathies for the devil. The machinery of persecution had created its own momentum, consuming anyone who tried to slow or stop its operation. Margaret herself had become a symbol that transcended her individual fate. To the authorities, she represented the ultimate triumph of divine justice over supernatural evil. To the citizens, she embodied both the reality of diabolic threat and the power of their protectors to overcome it. To future generations, she would represent something else entirely, a warning about the horrors that human beings could inflict on each other when fear overcame reason and justice became indistinguishable from vengeance. The stage was now set for the final act of her destruction, a public execution that would demonstrate the full power of the system that had consumed her. What awaited her would make everything she had already endured seem like preparation for the true horror that was yet to come.